Welcome back to Sister Wives Now. I am Sophie Summers, and you are watching Sister Wives Now. Today, we are going to break down a story that the show itself is desperately trying not to tell you. A story buried under tears, half-truths, deflection, and a carefully manufactured narrative meant to protect the wrong people. Because what you are watching unfold is not confusing. It's not miscommunication. It's not a family falling apart naturally. It is a strategy. And it starts with something so small, so boring, so unglamorous, that most viewers missed it entirely: paperwork. What's interesting is that the sale of Coyote Pass didn't collapse because people couldn't agree. It didn't stall because emotions were too raw. It didn't fall apart because Meri was being difficult, or because Janelle was plotting, or because Kody was overwhelmed. No. The sale collapsed because everything was already done, and someone showed up at the very last second demanding silence. The title work had been completed. The signatures had been gathered. The checks had been sent to the title company so no one could complain about fees. The beer was locked in. The contract was days away from closing. And then, suddenly, Robyn Brown appeared. Not with cooperation, not with compromise, but with conditions. She said she would not proceed unless everyone signed a confidentiality agreement and a hold harmless clause, a document that would ensure one thing and one thing only: Meri Brown would never be able to recover her money or speak about what actually happened. And that moment, that is where this story really begins. Because from that moment on, everything you were told on the show became a lie of omission. Let's be very clear, right from the start, because there is no benefit in dancing around this. Kody and Robyn Brown are the villains here. Not Janelle, not Meri, and the longer the show tries to force a narrative where these women are pitted against each other, the more obvious the deflection becomes. This backdoor deal storyline, it's a smokescreen. It exists to keep you looking left while the truth sits plainly on the right. And the truth is this: the only person who still has legal power, leverage, and exposure risk in this situation is Meri Brown. And that is exactly why the NDA mattered. The tell-all should have been the moment where this all came into focus. Instead, it became an exercise in narrative management. No documents were reviewed. No timelines were examined. No follow-up questions were asked. The host accepted emotional explanations at face value and moved on, leaving viewers to argue amongst themselves while the real issue went untouched. Social media noticed. Within minutes of the episode airing, comment sections lit up with confusion and frustration. Why is no one asking about the paperwork? Why are we ignoring who delayed the sale? Why does this feel like Meri is being blamed again? And that discomfort you felt, that's because something wasn't adding up. So let's walk through what actually happened, not emotionally, not symbolically, but chronologically. In January of 2025, Janelle signed the documents. In January of 2025, Meri signed the documents. In January of 2025, Kody signed the documents. All parties agreed to the sale. The beer moved forward under the assumption that the deal was solid. Robyn did not sign. Not in January. Not quietly. Not accidentally. Weeks passed. The contract inched closer to expiration. Janelle became anxious, understandably so. A missed sale meant lost leverage, lost money, and more delays. Behind the scenes, Robyn remained silent. No group conversations. No transparency. No urgency. And when she finally spoke, she did not speak about fairness. She spoke about control. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. Robyn framed herself as the last person holding onto a dream. She spoke about Coyote Pass as if it were a sacred symbol of family unity, a vision she alone still cherished. She described herself as devastated, abandoned, left behind as everyone else moved on. It was emotional. It was poetic. And it was completely misleading. Because here's the part that matters. The part the show does not want you to sit with for too long. Robyn was already living in a $2.1 million home at the time she made these claims. A home purchased using funds that originated from the sale of Kody and Meri's Vegas property. funds Meri was legally entitled to. Joint tenants own 50% of the equity. That's not my opinion. That's the law. And yet, when that Vegas home sold, Kody took 100% of the proceeds and transferred them to Robyn. She benefited from that money. She lived in it. She used it. And later, those funds were rolled into another property held in trust, effectively erasing Meri's equity from the paper trail. So when Robyn stood on camera and spoke about emotional attachment to land she was actively preventing from being sold, while living comfortably off money that was not hers alone, something became very clear. This was never about grief. It was about exposure. Because if the sale went through cleanly, without conditions, without silence, without waivers, Meri would be paid, and Meri would be free to talk. And that is the one outcome Kody and Robyn could not allow. That's why the NDA appears when it does. That's why it includes a hold harmless clause. That's why it waives future legal claims. That's why it demands confidentiality about how the deal went down. You don't demand silence when you're innocent. You demand silence when you're afraid. Janelle saw through the emotional performance immediately. On camera, she questioned whether Robyn even believed what she was saying, whether she was simply playing a role she thought she was supposed to play. The loyal wife, the heartbroken sister's wife, the last believer in a broken dream. But here's the thing, roles exist for a reason. And this role serves to distract from the fact that Robyn delayed the sale, blocked the signatures, and only re-engaged when she could attach legal strings that protected her from accountability. This is where tension in the audience begins to build, because viewers start to realize something uncomfortable. The show is asking you to empathize with someone whose actions don't match their words. And when words and actions diverge, the truth is always hiding in the actions. By the time the NDA is introduced, nearly 2 months have passed. The beer is restless. The deal is fragile. And suddenly, a fully drafted legal document appears. Not a suggestion, not a discussion, but a demand. Sign this, or the sale doesn't happen. Sign this, or you don't get paid. Sign this, or you stay quiet forever. And Meri said no. That single refusal changes everything. Because from that moment forward, the narrative had to be rewritten. Meri could no longer be framed as cooperative. She had to become difficult, dangerous, unstable, the problem. And if you've watched this show long enough, you recognize that pattern instantly. This is not the first time Meri has been positioned as the obstacle when she was actually the boundary. And that's where we pause, not because the story slows down, but because this is the exact moment the mask starts to slip. The moment Meri refused to sign that document, the temperature in the room changed, not just among the Browns, but in the narrative itself. Because refusal is dangerous in a system built on obedience. And Meri's no wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. And it wasn't loud. It was calm. It was legal. And that's exactly why it terrified them. What people need to understand is this: Meri didn't refuse because she wanted to blow up the sale. She refused because the document in front of her wasn't about closing a deal. It was about closing her mouth. And those are two very different things. Almost immediately, the language around Meri shifted. Watch closely and you'll notice it. Suddenly, she's hard to work with. Suddenly, she's not communicating. Suddenly, she's stuck in the past. These are not accidental phrases. These are narrative tools. They are designed to make the audience question her credibility before she ever gets the chance to speak freely. And social media clocked it instantly. Reddit threads exploded overnight. TikTok creators paused scenes frame by frame, pointing out how often Meri was interrupted or spoken about rather than spoken to. Twitter lit up with viewers asking the same question over and over again. Why does it feel like Meri is being punished for asking for protection? Because she is. Let's go back to that NDA for a second, because this is where things get very uncomfortable very fast. The document wasn't just a confidentiality agreement. It included a hold harmless clause and a waiver of future claims. That matters a lot. A confidentiality agreement alone says, don't talk publicly about this deal. A hold harmless clause says, you cannot sue us if you are harmed. A waiver of future claims says, you are giving up your right to ever seek legal remedy, even for things you don't know about yet. That's not standard. That's not casual. And that is not something you ask for unless you are actively protecting yourself from potential exposure. So when Robyn frames this as just wanting peace or just wanting closure, that framing collapses under even minimal scrutiny. Peace does not require stripping someone of their legal rights. Closure does not require permanent silence. Fear does. And the show never asked the obvious question, why now? Why was this document introduced after everyone else had already signed? Why wasn't it discussed upfront? Why wasn't it negotiated transparently? Why was it tied directly to Meri getting her money? Those omissions are not mistakes. They are choices. And here's where Kody's own words become impossible to ignore. During the episode, Kody admits on camera that he believed he had no legal obligation to pay Meri anything from the Vegas house proceeds. He didn't say it vaguely. He didn't hedge. He said it plainly, as if it were common sense. That statement alone should have stopped the conversation cold, because Kody is wrong. Legally wrong. Joint tenancy means equal ownership. 50%, not 0. Not whatever the husband decides, and the fact that he believed otherwise tells you everything about how that money was treated from the start, not as shared marital property, but as a resource he could redirect at will. And redirect it he did. The money from that Vegas home went directly into Robyn's living situation. She benefited. She continues to benefit. And yet, when it comes time to sell Coyote Pass, an asset Meri is also legally tied to, suddenly Robyn needs protection. Protection from what? From accountability. This is where the emotional manipulation ramps up. Robyn's tears become more frequent. Her language becomes softer. She positions herself as misunderstood, as someone who just wants harmony. And that performance works, at least on a surface level, because viewers are conditioned to associate tears with truth. But tears are not evidence. Timelines are. And the timeline here is damning. Robyn delays the sale. Robyn introduces the NDA. Robyn benefits from Meri's past assets. Robyn demands silence before Meri gets paid. That sequence tells a story far more clearly than any confessional ever could. Janelle, to her credit, does not fully buy into the performance. She questions it. She expresses skepticism. She points out that Robyn often says what she thinks she's supposed to say, rather than what she actually believes. And while Janelle is careful, maybe too careful, her discomfort is visible. But here's where the tension between Janelle and Meri becomes a convenient distraction. Instead of focusing on why the NDA exists, the narrative pivots to whether Meri and Janelle are aligned. Instead of asking who delayed the sale, the show asks who communicated better. Instead of examining legal exposure, viewers are encouraged to debate personality conflicts. And it works because conflict is easier to digest than corruption. Meanwhile, Meri stays quiet. And that quiet is misinterpreted as weakness, when in reality, it is restraint. She is speaking through attorneys now. She is protecting herself. She is doing the one thing she has historically not been allowed to do in this family. Set a boundary that cannot be overridden by emotion. When Meri finally does speak, her words are measured but devastating. I will not be silenced again. That sentence lands like a punch. Because again implies history. Again implies pattern. Again implies that this is not the first time. And suddenly, the NDA stops being a one-off request and starts looking like part of a larger system. A system where Meri's compliance has been extracted repeatedly, quietly, and legally until she finally decided she was done. This is where longtime viewers feel a shift. You can see it in reaction videos, in comment sections, in live chats. People start connecting dots that have been dangling for years. Why Meri often looks guarded. Why she speaks carefully. Why she avoids specifics. Why she has historically absorbed blame without defending herself. Because when you are bound by silence, defending yourself becomes risky. And that's why the stakes of this sale were never just financial. They were existential. If Meri signed that document, she would be signing away not just money, but truth. And Kody and Robyn knew that. That's why the anger that follows her refusal feels disproportionate. It's not frustration over a delayed deal. It's rage over a failed tactic. A tactic designed to ensure that Meri's story, whatever it fully contains, never reaches daylight. So ask yourself this: if Meri had signed, what would we never have known? And more importantly, what still hasn't been said? The silence surrounding those questions is not accidental. It is enforced. And the moment enforcement fails, the system starts to crack. That crack is widening. And what comes next is where the real panic sets in. What happens when a silence strategy fails is never calm. It never looks reasonable. It looks like confusion, deflection, and panic wrapped in moral outrage. And that's exactly the phase this story enters once Meri doesn't cave. Because once she refuses to sign, the goal shifts. It's no longer about convincing her. It's about isolating her. And this is where the narrative gets darker. Watch how quickly the language changes from "we're trying to be fair" to "Meri is stopping everything." That pivot isn't subtle, it's aggressive. It reframes a woman protecting her legal rights as a woman sabotaging the family. And in a family system that has always weaponized loyalty, that accusation is lethal. This is not about logistics. This is about obedience. Kody doesn't argue law. He doesn't argue facts. He argues betrayal. He frames Meri's resistance as emotional instability, as bitterness, as an inability to move on. And Robyn echoes it, softly, carefully, but consistently. She positions herself as the wounded peacemaker who just wants everyone to get along, while standing firmly behind the document that would permanently silence the one person most capable of contradicting her. That contradiction matters, because Meri is the only one with a clear, documented financial paper trail tying Kody's past marital assets directly to Robyn's present lifestyle. Janelle cannot sue. Christine walked away. Meri is the only one left with standing legally and historically. And everyone knows it. That's why the pressure isn't equal. Janelle isn't handed an NDA. Christine isn't threatened with delayed payment. Only Meri is told, explicitly or implicitly, sign or suffer the consequences. And when she doesn't sign, the punishment begins. Social media caught this shift instantly. Viewers noticed how Meri stopped being addressed directly, how conversations about her happened in rooms she wasn't in, how her motives were speculated on, but never clarified. That's classic containment strategy. Talk about the threat, never to it. Because when you speak directly to someone who knows the truth, you risk exposure. The most telling moment doesn't come from Robyn or Kody. It comes from the edit. The show avoids explaining the NDA in detail. It avoids legal context. It avoids asking why Meri's lawyer is involved while others are speaking casually. Instead, it focuses on tone, body language, and feelings. That's not accidental. When facts don't favor you, you shift the conversation to vibes. And the vibe they want is simple. Meri is difficult. Meri is bitter. Meri is stuck. Meri is emotional. Meri is dangerous. Dangerous is the key word. Because dangerous people don't need to be listened to, they need to be managed. This is why later comments about Meri being unsafe or unpredictable land differently when you rewatch the season. They are not random. They are preemptive character attacks designed to undermine credibility before truth can surface. And Meri knows it. That's why she stops explaining herself. People misread her silence as passivity, but it's the opposite. It's strategy. Because anything she says without protection can be twisted. Any emotion can be weaponized. Any frustration can be labeled as instability. So she lets the paperwork speak. And the paperwork does not lie. Here's what the show glosses over. By the time Robyn introduces the NDA, the property division had already been agreed upon. The supposed concern about fairness was already resolved. There was no unresolved inequity to justify delaying signatures, which means the delay was never about equity. It was about leverage. Robyn doesn't sign until the moment she can attach conditions, conditions that benefit her, conditions that protect her. Conditions that do nothing for Meri except take away options. That's not a compromise. That's coercion. And coercion becomes very obvious when time pressure is applied. The deal is expiring. The beer is waiting. Everyone is anxious. That's when the document appears, fully drafted, non-negotiable, take it or leave it. That's a power play. Janelle calls it that outright. And she's right. But here's where the internal fractures deepen. Janelle admits carefully that her lawyer suggested pushing the sale through. That admission becomes ammunition. Suddenly, the narrative becomes about whether Janelle betrayed Meri, whether Janelle spoke out of turn, whether Janelle gave Kody ideas. And just like that, the spotlight shifts away from the people who actually wrote the NDA. This is textbook misdirection. Instead of asking why Robyn needed legal insulation, viewers are nudged into debating sister-wife loyalty. Instead of examining financial wrongdoing, we're asked to assess emotional alignment. And that misdirection works because it taps into years of unresolved interpersonal tension. But strip away the emotion, and the facts remain stubborn. Meri did not delay the sale arbitrarily. Meri did not refuse to cooperate. Meri did not demand special treatment. Meri demanded one thing, the right to not be silenced. That's it. And the reaction to that demand tells you everything you need to know about how threatening it was. Kody's anger escalates. His language hardens. He begins speaking in absolutes. He frames himself as wronged, as disrespected, as attacked. And that's familiar because it's how he responds whenever control slips. Robyn, meanwhile, retreats into victimhood. She claims emotional devastation. She claims heartbreak. She claims confusion over why things are so hard. But she never withdraws the document. That's the detail that matters. If the NDA were truly about peace, it could be removed. If it were truly about closure, it could be revised. If it were truly about fairness, it wouldn't be conditional. But it stays because it's not symbolic. It's functional. And what it functions to do is prevent Meri from ever publicly explaining how money moved through this family, how assets were redirected, and how power was consolidated under the guise of unity. That's why the tension never resolves. That's why the sale stalls. That's why the hostility lingers. Because the real conflict isn't between sister wives. It's between truth and containment. And containment is failing. You can feel it in the way conversations stop abruptly, in the way Kody avoids specifics, in the way Robyn deflects into emotion whenever details surface, in the way Meri becomes increasingly precise with her words. Precision is dangerous when you're lying, and Meri is done being imprecise. What the audience is watching now is not a family dispute. It's the slow unraveling of a system that relied on one woman's silence to keep itself intact. And once silence is no longer guaranteed, everything built on it becomes unstable. That instability is growing. And the closer it gets to the surface, the harder it becomes to control what spills out. There's a moment in every long-running deception where the people maintaining it stop speaking in explanations and start speaking in fear. That's the phase we enter now, the phase where control becomes brittle, where narratives contradict themselves, and where the people who once felt untouchable begin tightening their grip so hard it exposes the very thing they're trying to hide. Because once Meri refuses to sign away her silence, something fundamental breaks. Up until this point, Kody and Robyn are still operating under an old assumption. That resistance will eventually soften. That pressure will work. That exhaustion will win. That's how this family has always functioned. Wear people down. Let time blur memory. Let confusion replace clarity. Let loyalty override logic. But Meri doesn't bend. And when she doesn't, the strategy escalates. This is where the rhetoric turns dangerous. Suddenly, it's no longer just Meri is difficult. It's Meri is unreasonable. Then Meri is emotional. Then Meri is unsafe. And finally, Meri is a threat. That language matters. Because in systems built on hierarchy, labeling someone a threat is how you justify silencing them. You don't argue with threats. You neutralize them. And the way they attempt to neutralize Meri is by rewriting history in real time. We start hearing phrases like there was never an agreement, nothing was promised, no one owes anyone anything. Kody even says it out loud, that he believes he has no legal obligation to give Meri money she is claiming. He calls it a loophole. He says it casually, almost proudly. That alone should stop every viewer cold, because loopholes are not morality, they're evasion. And when someone relies on a loophole, they're admitting something without realizing it, that if fairness were applied, they would lose. This is where Robyn's role becomes impossible to ignore. She has no marital claim to Meri's assets, none. She was not part of that marriage. She did not contribute to those properties, and yet she is the primary beneficiary of the money that flowed out of Meri's joint tenancy with Kody. That's not emotional. That's transactional. And when you benefit from a transaction that may not survive legal scrutiny, silence becomes valuable. Very valuable. Which explains why the NDA is so broad. Why it doesn't just address the sale. Why it includes future claims. Why it includes hold harmless language. Why it restricts speech. This is not about one deal. This is about insulating a lifestyle. Social media reaction at this point explodes, not because of what's being said, but because of what isn't. Viewers notice how Robyn never explains why she needs protection. She never says from what. She never clarifies what she's afraid Meri will say. Instead, she speaks in abstractions: pain, heartbreak, loss, family. Those words are emotional fog. And fog is useful when clarity would be damaging. Janelle's frustration grows sharper here, because unlike Robyn, she speaks in specifics. She talks about timing. She talks about documents. She talks about delays. And when she calls the NDA presentation a power play, she's naming the truth they don't want named. Power was being exercised, and it wasn't subtle. Robyn disappears from discussions for weeks, lets Kody negotiate, deflect, stall, then reappears at the exact moment pressure is highest with a fully formed legal demand. That's not indecision. That's orchestration. And when Meri responds not with emotion but with lawyers, the entire tone shifts. Because lawyers change everything. Lawyers mean documentation. Lawyers mean timelines. Lawyers mean consequences. That's why Meri suddenly becomes framed as cold, distant, and willing to talk. They criticize her for communicating through legal counsel, as if that's unreasonable when someone is trying to strip you of your rights. But the truth is simpler. Meri stops talking because talking is what got her trapped before. And she learned. This is the part viewers need to sit with because it reframes years of behavior. Meri's guardedness, her hesitations, her pauses, her carefully chosen words. Those weren't personality flaws. They were survival mechanisms. Because when you've already been silenced once, you recognize the signs when it's happening again. And make no mistake, Meri saying "I will not be silenced again" is not a dramatic line. It's a declaration. It's a refusal to play the role she was assigned. And that refusal terrifies people who benefited from her compliance. Kody's reaction becomes increasingly erratic. He contradicts himself. One moment he says fairness matters. The next he says he owes nothing. One moment he claims unity. The next he blames betrayal. That inconsistency is not confusion, it's stress. Stress from trying to maintain a narrative that no longer aligns with reality. Robyn, meanwhile, leans harder into victimhood. She claims she's misunderstood. She claims she's being attacked. She claims she's just trying to protect herself. But here's the problem: protection implies danger. And if Meri speaking the truth is dangerous to Robyn, then the truth itself is what Robyn is afraid of. The show never asks that question, but the audience does. Online commentary turns brutal. Viewers begin connecting dots that production won't. They pull old clips, old statements, old financial timelines. They notice how Robyn's lifestyle improved dramatically after the Vegas sale. They notice how Meri's security vanished. And they ask the question the show refuses to ask. Why does Robyn need Meri to be quiet? There is no innocent answer to that. This is why the emotional manipulation intensifies. This is why Meri is reframed as stubborn instead of principled. This is why Janelle and Meri are subtly pushed apart, because divided women compare notes less often. Divide and distract, classic, but even that starts to fail. Because the facts don't change no matter how many times the story does. Robyn delayed signing. Robyn introduced the NDA. Robyn benefits financially. Meri has legal standing. And silence was demanded when exposure became possible. That's the spine of this story. Everything else is noise. And the closer the truth gets to the surface, the more desperate the containment becomes, which is why what comes next is even uglier. Because when legal pressure doesn't work, and emotional pressure doesn't work, and narrative pressure doesn't work, the only option left is character assassination. And that's exactly where this is headed. When character assassination begins, it's never loud at first. It's subtle. It's whispered. It's planted in implication. And by the time you realize it's happening, the target has already been reframed in the public mind as someone whose words can't be trusted. That's the phase we enter now. Because once Meri refuses to sign the NDA, once she refuses to give up her legal rights, once she refuses to stay quiet, the problem for Kody and Robyn is no longer contractual. It's reputational. They don't need Meri to agree anymore. They need Meri to be disbelieved. And that's a very different goal. This is where the language surrounding Meri becomes colder, sharper, and more insidious. Suddenly, conversations about her aren't about money or fairness. They're about behavior, about tone, about emotional stability, about whether she's safe to talk to. And that framing is deliberate. Because if you can convince people that someone is emotionally volatile, you don't have to refute their facts. You just have to question their credibility. This tactic isn't new in this family. We've seen it before. Anytime a wife challenges Kody's authority, the response is never accountability. It's dismissal. She's angry. She's bitter. She's stuck in the past. She's unstable. But with Meri, it goes further. Because Meri isn't just emotionally inconvenient. She's legally dangerous. And that's why we hear something truly chilling later on when Kody implies that Meri could hurt him if certain things were said. That statement is not casual. It's not offhand. It's a strategic escalation. Because once someone is framed as potentially violent or unstable, their testimony becomes suspect by default. That's not an accident. That's preemptive damage control. The audience reaction to this moment is immediate and visceral. Social media explodes with disbelief. Viewers replay the clip over and over, asking the same question: how did we get here? How did a woman asserting her right to not be silenced get reframed as a threat? And the answer is uncomfortable. Because the truth Meri holds is not just personal, it's systemic. It implicates patterns. It implicates behavior over years. It implicates financial decisions that benefited one household at the expense of another. It implicates silence that may have been contractually enforced before. And if Meri speaks freely, those patterns don't just embarrass Kody and Robyn, they expose them. That's why the NDA wasn't limited to the property sale. That's why it included future claims. That's why it demanded silence beyond the transaction. It wasn't about one deal. It was about shutting the door on a decade of questions. Think about it. Meri has been hinting for years that there's more to the story. She's said it repeatedly. She's said it carefully. She said it without details, because details carry risk. Viewers used to dismiss that as evasiveness. Now it looks like restraint. Because once you understand that NDAs may already exist, that silence may have been purchased before, her behavior stops looking confusing and starts looking calculated. Calculated for survival. And here's the part no one wants to confront. Robyn didn't just benefit from Meri's silence, she needed it. Because Robyn's public image relies entirely on moral contrast. She is the empathetic wife, the loyal wife, the one who wanted the family. The one who sacrificed. That image cannot survive direct scrutiny of how money moved into her household. It cannot survive questions about why she lives in a multi-million-dollar home while another wife walked away financially depleted. It cannot survive documentation, which is why documentation is the enemy here. This is also why Janelle's role becomes so uncomfortable in this phase. Because Janelle, unlike Robyn, is blunt. She says things plainly. And she admits things openly, including the fact that she has no legal recourse because she signed a gift letter. That detail is devastating because it reveals how different the stakes are for each woman. Janelle can't sue. Christine won't. Meri can, which makes Meri the last line of exposure. And when someone becomes the last line, pressure intensifies. That's why the narrative tries to pivot blame onto Janelle, suggesting she entertained a backdoor deal, suggesting she spoke to Kody separately, suggesting she betrayed Meri. Whether or not those conversations happened is almost irrelevant because they didn't change the outcome. The deal did not go through that way. Meri's lawyers stopped it, but the accusation serves its purpose: fracture trust. Because fractured women don't unite. And unity is the greatest threat to a controlled narrative. But here's the twist: it doesn't fully work. Because even through the tension, even through the hurt, the core truth remains undeniable. Robyn delayed signing. Robyn introduced the NDA. Robyn demanded silence. Robyn benefited financially. No amount of emotional reframing can erase that sequence. And the more Kody and Robyn try to push the blame outward, the more obvious it becomes that they're running from something. You can feel the panic now. It shows in the defensiveness. It shows in the contradictions. It shows in the sudden need to rewrite old agreements as non-existent. Because when people start saying that was never promised years after everyone acted as if it were, you're watching history being rewritten in self-defense. And Meri sees it. That's why she stops engaging emotionally. That's why she limits access. That's why she lets her lawyer speak. Because this is no longer a family issue. It's an exposure issue. And the most telling sign that Kody and Robyn know they're vulnerable is this: they are angrier about Meri refusing to be quiet than they are about the sale falling apart. That should tell you everything. If the sale were the priority, silence wouldn't matter. If fairness were the priority, rights wouldn't be waived. If unity were the priority, threats wouldn't be implied. But silence was the priority, because silence protects something far bigger than one property. And now that silence is cracking. And once it cracks, it doesn't matter how many times you call someone unstable. The truth has a way of cutting through the noise. Which brings us to the final reckoning. Because at this point, there's only one question left. What happens when the woman you tried to silence decides she has nothing left to lose? This is the point where everything converges, not quietly, not neatly, but with pressure so intense it forces the truth into the open whether anyone wants it there or not. Because when someone reaches the moment where they realize silence has already cost them everything, fear stops working, control stops working, and the power dynamic flips. That's where Meri is now. She is no longer negotiating from a place of hope. She's negotiating from a place of clarity. And clarity is dangerous to people who survive on manipulation. What Kody and Robyn never anticipated is that the woman they had sidelined, minimized, and emotionally starved for years would eventually stop trying to belong and start trying to protect herself. They assumed she would keep absorbing losses quietly the way she always had. They assumed loyalty would override self-preservation. They were wrong. Because when Meri refused to sign that NDA, she didn't just say no to a document. She said no to the entire system that had benefited from her silence. She exposed the real hierarchy. She exposed the financial imbalance. She exposed a pattern of control disguised as family unity. And once that happened, everything else you're seeing makes sense. The panic, the anger, the sudden need to discredit her, the fixation on making her look like the problem. That's not coincidence. That's containment failure. Because if Meri speaks freely, the story doesn't stop at Coyote Pass. It doesn't stop at Vegas. It doesn't stop at one sale or one agreement. It opens the door to questions about how money flowed for years, how decisions were made without consent, how one wife's marital assets became another wife's lifestyle, and how silence may have been purchased more than once to keep that system intact. That's why the NDA mattered so much. That's why it was non-negotiable. That's why it arrived at the last possible second, under maximum pressure, when people were desperate and exhausted and just wanted it over with. That's how coercion works. And it failed. Now look at what's left behind in the wreckage of that failure. Kody is exposed as someone who openly admits to using loopholes instead of fairness. Someone who believes legality absolves morality. Someone who frames accountability as betrayal. Robyn is exposed as someone who positions herself as a victim while benefiting disproportionately from outcomes that harm others. Someone who claims emotional devastation while demanding legal protection. Someone who wants sympathy without scrutiny. And Meri, the woman who was supposed to quietly fade away, stands as the only one who said no. No to silence. No to erasure. No to being rewritten out of her own history. That's why this story feels unfinished. Because it is. The sale eventually goes through, but the truth doesn't close with it. The resentment doesn't vanish. The questions don't disappear. And the audience, once distracted by emotional framing, now sees the pattern too clearly to unsee it. You cannot demand silence from someone unless you're afraid of what they might say. You cannot insist on an NDA unless exposure carries risk. You cannot claim innocence while simultaneously blocking accountability. And the more Kody and Robyn try to shut this down, the louder it becomes. That's the irony of control. It collapses under its own weight. Meri didn't need to shout. She didn't need to explode. She didn't need to expose everything all at once. All she had to do was refuse to be quiet. And that refusal changed the balance of power forever. Now the narrative they worked so hard to protect is unstable. Every old clip is re-examined. Every financial decision is questioned. Every emotional appeal is scrutinized for motive. The audience is no longer consuming the story. They're interrogating it. And that is the last thing controlled narratives can survive. So here's the reality no one on that couch wanted to admit. This was never about a backdoor deal. It was never about emotional attachment to land. It was never about fairness or unity or heartbreak. It was about preventing one woman from connecting the dots out loud. And that failed. So now the question isn't whether Meri was difficult. The question is why it took this long for anyone to listen to her. Because when someone spends years hinting that there's more to the story, and the moment they refuse to sign away their voice, everything implodes. That tells you exactly where the truth has been buried. And once buried truth starts pushing upward, it doesn't stop. It cracks foundations. It shatters facades. It forces reckonings. And this story is standing right on the edge of one. If you're watching this unfold and feeling unsettled, that's because you're seeing control without its mask. You're seeing power panic. You're seeing what happens when silence is no longer guaranteed. And this is why this matters. Not because it's reality TV, not because it's drama, but because it shows how easily narratives are manipulated and how powerful it is when someone finally refuses to cooperate. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think the NDA was about protection or about prevention? Do you think this was the first time silence was demanded or just the first time it was refused? And what do you think Meri knows that scared them this much? If this breakdown gave you clarity, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Sister Wives Now, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next. Drop your thoughts in the comments because this conversation is far from over, and the truth always comes out when people stop agreeing to stay quiet.